The whole room laughed when the Duke of Ashworth walked past the most beautiful woman in England and offered his hand to the plain widow standing in the corner. They laughed because Margaret Vane was 40 years old and poor and nobody, a widow in a made-over gown, brought to the ball for one reason only, to fetch and carry for her beautiful young cousin. She had not been asked to dance in 20 years. She had not expected to be asked tonight. And the Duke, who could have had any woman in that room and was expected to choose the loveliest of them before the evening was out, crossed the floor and stopped in front of her and went very quiet. Her cousin laughed loudest of all, but the Duke of Ashworth was not looking at Margaret's plain gray gown, or her tired face, or the 20 hard years the world had written across it. He was looking at her throat, at the thin, worn cord, half hidden beneath her collar, and the plain gold ring that hung on the end of it, a ring he had last held 20 years ago, a ring he had pressed with his own hands into the palm of a young woman who had saved his life on the worst night of it, and then vanished before he could so much as learn her name. "They're laughing," the Duke said, so quietly that only she could hear him, "because they don't know what you are." He lifted his eyes from the ring to her face. "I do?" Margaret had worn that ring hidden against her skin for 20 years, and never told one living soul where it came from. But someone in that ballroom knew. Someone had spent 20 years praying this exact moment would never, ever come, because the day the Duke of Ashworth recognized that ring was the day a secret buried for 2 decades began to claw its way back up out of the ground. Stay with me, because the plain widow they all laughed at tonight was about to become the most dangerous woman in England, and she did not even know it yet. To understand tonight, you have to understand the 20 years that came before it. And to understand those, you have to understand what Margaret Vane had been reduced to. She had not always been the woman in the corner holding someone else's fan. Once, a long time ago, in another life it sometimes seemed, Margaret had been a gentleman's daughter with a modest fortune of her own and a quick, warm way about her that made people lean in when she spoke. She had been happy. She had been loved, briefly, terribly, by a young man with nothing to his name. And then it had all gone wrong in a single season, in a way she had never fully understood. And she had come out the other side of it, married off to a poor curate twice her age, and sent to a cold living in the north. Her husband had not been cruel. He had simply been indifferent and old, and then, after 15 gray years, dead, leaving Margaret with no children, no money, and nowhere on earth to go except back to the family that had wanted her gone in the first place. Her aunt, Lady Vane, had taken her in. Everyone said how good it was of her. "You'll make yourself useful, of course," Lady Vane had said on the first morning in the warm voice she used for her cruelest instructions. "Sophia will need a companion this season, someone sensible, someone who won't compete." And that was that. At 40, Margaret Vane became the unpaid servant of the household, companion to her beautiful 19-year-old cousin Sophia, fetcher of shawls, writer of letters, sitter-up with headaches, and standing furniture at every ball where Sophia was paraded before the eligible men of England. She was very good at being invisible. She had learned it the way you learn anything, through long, grinding practice. But here is the thing about a woman everyone has agreed to stop seeing. She sees everything. Margaret stood in the corners of 100 ballrooms and watched and listened, and no one ever lowered their voice for her, because who lowers their voice in front of the furniture? She had heard things over the years, small things, odd things, things that didn't quite fit, and though she didn't know it yet, standing in that corner with her cousin's fan in her hand, Margaret Vane already held, scattered in pieces across 20 years of overheard remarks, very nearly the whole of a secret that could burn her aunt's house to the ground. She never took the ring off. 20 years, on a cord around her neck, tucked beneath her collar, where no one could see it. Through her marriage, through her widowhood, through every humiliation her aunt could devise, the one thing that was hers, and only hers, and that no one had ever managed to take. She could not entirely have told you why she kept it. The young man who gave it to her was 20 years gone. She had been, 20, 21, a different person. A girl who still believed the world was kind. She remembered his hands more than his face now. Isn't that a strange thing? 20 years wears a face away. But she remembered the weight of the ring, and the way he'd folded her fingers over it, and the thing he'd said, "Until I can find you again." and she remembered that she had believed him completely for about 6 weeks. And then the scandal had come. Out of nowhere, a whisper that became a roar, that Margaret Vane had been compromised, had been secretly meeting a man of no fortune, had disgraced herself beyond saving. She never learned where it started. It didn't matter where it started. By the time it was done, her reputation was in ruins. The young man had been driven off in disgrace. Her father had married her to the curate inside 2 months to bury the shame. And the girl who believed the world was kind was gone for good. She kept the ring. Some stubborn, unbroken part of her kept the ring. Hold on to the scandal, a whisper that became a roar, out of nowhere. Margaret never understood where it came from. 20 years on, she'd stopped asking. She thought it was just bad luck, the cruelty of a careless world. It was not bad luck. Somebody made that whisper. Somebody had a reason, and that somebody was, at this very moment, sitting 3 feet away, laughing at her across a ballroom floor. Now, the Duke. Adrian, Duke of Ashworth, was 42 that season, and the great puzzle of fashionable London. He was rich, titled, unmarried, and, by the account of every matchmaking mother in England, quietly, immovably impossible. For 20 years he had been offered the loveliest women of every season, and for 20 years he had been perfectly polite and perfectly unmoved and had gone home alone. They did not know what he was looking for. He had never told anyone. It would have sounded like madness, and dukes are permitted a great many things, but madness is not quite one of them. He was looking for a woman he had met exactly once, 20 years ago, when he had been nobody at all. He had not been a duke then. He'd been the 4th son of a ruined house. No money, no prospects, a title 3 deaths away, and no one expecting those deaths. He had fallen ill on a journey, badly, the kind of fever that empties a man out, and he had been turned away from an inn and left to die in the cold because no one wanted the contagion. And a young woman had found him, a gentleman's daughter, out where she should not have been. She had not run for help. Help would have meant exposure, ruin, her own name destroyed for being found with a strange man. She had done the braver thing and the more foolish thing. She had stayed. She had nursed him through 3 nights of fever with her own hands, in secret, asking nothing. And on the 4th morning, when the fever broke and he woke weak and alive and hers, he had nothing on earth to give her but one thing, his mother's ring, the last thing of value his ruined family still owned. "Until I can find you again," he had said, and folded her fingers over it. And then the world had happened to them both. He was called away that same day. A family emergency. One of those 3 unlikely deaths, the beginning of the chain that would make him a duke. By the time he could return and look for her, she was gone. Vanished. A scandal, someone said. Married off, someone else said. Nobody would give a straight answer, and a 4th son with no name had no power to make them. He became a duke. He looked for her for 20 years. He never found her. Until a plain widow in a made-over gown turned her head at a ball, and her collar shifted, and he saw a plain gold ring on a worn cord, his mother's ring, hanging against her throat. If your heart just turned over, if you're only now realizing that the plain widow the whole room laughed at is the woman he's been searching for across 20 years, then you already understand what this channel is for, the overlooked ones, the women the world stopped seeing, the quiet, extraordinary things they did. Once, when no one was watching and never told a soul. That's every story I tell here. Subscribe and stay with me, because Margaret is about to learn who she is again, and what she does with it is the part you will never forget. Here is what the ballroom did not understand, and what made the whole thing stranger still. Margaret did not recognize him. 20 years. A fever-thin young man of 22, half dead in the dark, becomes a broad, gray-templed duke of 42 in the blaze of 1,000 candles. She had nursed a dying boy whose face she could barely picture anymore. She was looking at a powerful stranger who had, for reasons she could not fathom, just humiliated her in front of all of London by singling her out for a joke she didn't understand. Because that is what she assumed it was. A joke, a cruelty, some game of the great and idle that she, the furniture, had somehow been dragged into. "Your Grace." Her voice was steady because she had 20 years of practice keeping it steady. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I am not part of whatever this is. Please, let me go back to my corner." "You don't know me," the Duke said. It wasn't a question. Something moved across his face. Grief, almost. Of course you don't. Why would you? He looked for a moment, like a man who had run a very long way, only to find the door had changed. May I ask you one thing, and then, if you wish it, I will leave you in peace all evening. The ring you wear, on the cord. He paused. Where did it come from? And Margaret's hand went, without her permission, to her collar. That, she said slowly, is none of your concern. No, he agreed, it isn't. Except that I have been looking for it for 20 years. He held her eyes. And for the woman I gave it to. Watch what's happening to her, here, because this is the real turn, not his. Margaret has spent 20 years being told she is nothing. Furniture, the useful cousin, a woman no man would ever cross a room for. And a duke has just crossed a room for her, and told her he's spent 20 years searching for her. And every instinct beaten into her over 2 decades is screaming that it must be a trick, a cruelty, a mistake, because women like her do not get found. And underneath all of that, very quietly, something she thought had died a long time ago is beginning, terribly, to wake up. He told her, there at the edge of the ballroom, with 300 people staring. He kept his voice low, and he did not touch her, and he told her about a fever 20 years ago, and an inn that turned him out, and the cold, and the certainty that he was going to die alone in it. He told her about a young woman with a lantern who should have run and didn't. 3 nights. Her own hands. Asking nothing. I never saw where you went, he said. I woke, and it was the 4th day, and I was alive, and I was called away before noon. My uncle, and then my cousin. A whole family dying one after another that year. And I, a 4th son, turned duke inside 18 months. And when I could finally come back and look for you, his jaw tightened. You were gone. A scandal, they said. Married and sent away. No one would tell me your name. I was nobody then. I had no way to make them. Margaret stood very still, because she remembered. Not his face. His face was gone, worn away by 20 years. But she remembered the stable, and the fever, and the boy she'd been so sure would die, and the ring pressed into her palm on the 4th morning, with a promise she'd believed for 6 whole weeks before the roof fell in on her life. You, she said, barely a breath. You were the... She stopped. Her hand closed hard around the ring through the cloth of her collar. You lived. I lived, said the Duke of Ashworth, because of you. And then I lost you inside a week, and I have been looking ever since. His voice cracked, just slightly, right down the middle. 20 years, madam. I had almost stopped believing you were real. The whole ballroom had gone silent now. Even the beauty had stopped laughing. So there it is. Mystery A, answered. That is why the Duke crossed the room. Not pity, not madness, not a cruel joke. He recognized his own ring on the throat of the woman who saved his life 20 years ago, and whom he had searched for ever since. The plain widow they laughed at is his lost love. It's the reunion of the century, and it's happening in front of all of London, which should be the end of the story, a happy ending tied off with a bow. Except for one small thing that Margaret is about to say. A single question that is going to crack this entire fairy tale wide open. But I didn't vanish, Margaret said. The Duke went still. I'm sorry. You said I vanished, that no one would tell you my name, that I'd been married off and sent away. Her brow had drawn down. That quick mind, 20 years underused, was turning over now, faster and faster. But I didn't vanish, Your Grace. I was here. I was ruined by a scandal that came out of nowhere, and married to a curate inside 2 months, and I never understood why, and... She stopped. The color was going out of her face. You came back to look for me. You said you came back. Within the month, the moment I could. Then someone stopped you finding me. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. Someone told you I'd vanished. Someone made certain you were sent away with no name and no trail. And someone, at the very same time, made certain I was ruined and married off and buried in the north, where no one would ever come looking. She lifted her eyes to his, and there was something new and terrible waking behind them. Your Grace, those were the same 6 weeks, the scandal that destroyed me, and the trail that went cold under your feet. They happened together. Yes, said the Duke slowly, I suppose they did. That is not 2 pieces of bad luck, Margaret whispered. That is one person. One person did both. One person tore us apart on purpose 20 years ago, ruined my whole life to do it. And I have been living in that person's house. And there it is, Mystery B cracked open and set loose to run. Not, will she get her happy ending? That question's nearly answered. The new one, the one that's going to pull you all the way to the end. Who did this? Who hated Margaret Vane enough 20 years ago to burn her life to the ground and hide her from the man who loved her? And why? Margaret doesn't know yet, but she has just realized something that changes everything. Whoever it was is still alive, still close, and has spent 20 years watching her fetch and carry and never once suspect. Stay with me, because Margaret Vane is about to stop being the furniture. And when the furniture starts asking questions, people who've been comfortable for 20 years should be very, very afraid. The Duke wanted to act at once. Lawyers, inquiries, the full weight of a dukedom brought down on the question tomorrow morning. Margaret said no. You don't understand how these people work, she told him later, when he had, scandalously wonderfully, walked her out to the terrace away from the staring crowd. If you come at them with lawyers and questions, they'll close ranks. Whoever did this has hidden it for 20 years. They'll hide it another 20. And I will be a mad woman making wild accusations against the family that generously took her in. She shook her head. No, if we're going to find out who did this, we do it quietly, and we do it my way. Which is? Margaret almost smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who has just discovered that 20 years of being invisible might, after all, have been good for something. Nobody in that house guards their tongue in front of me, she said. I'm the furniture, Your Grace. Do you have any idea what people say in front of the furniture? And she began, that very night, to remember. Because she had heard things, 20 years of scattered pieces, meaningless on their own, filed away by a mind too disciplined to throw anything out. Her aunt's voice through a door. And no one ever connected it back to us, thank God. A careless, cruel remark of Sophia's. Mama says Cousin Margaret was quite pretty once, before she disgraced herself. An old ledger she'd been made to copy, with a payment in it she'd never understood. A large sum, 20 years ago, to a man whose name meant nothing to her. It had all just been noise, the ordinary background noise of a house that despised her. She began now to hear the tune inside it. Because Margaret isn't going to be handed the truth. She's going to assemble it out of everything she was allowed to overhear, precisely because nobody imagined the furniture was listening. And she's about to find the first hard piece. Over the days that followed, Margaret went hunting. And she was very good at it. Better than she had any right to be. The companion had the run of the house, a reason to be in every room and to be seen in none. She read old letters her aunt had never dreamed she'd dare to touch. She found the ledger again, and this time she copied the name and the date, and sent them to the Duke, who had lawyers, who could find out who a man was. The man, it turned out, had been a gossip monger, a professional ruiner of reputations, dead these 10 years, who in his day was paid, handsomely, exactly the sum in the ledger, to start whispers and turn them into roars. Paid, 20 years ago, out of the Vane household accounts. And, in the same season, Margaret found this in an old letter in her aunt's own triumphant hand, tucked in a book no one had opened in 2 decades. A note to a distant relation. The matter of M is happily concluded. She is to be married to the curate at Hartley by month's end and gone to the north. S now stands as sole heiress, as she ought always to have been. You will agree it was necessary. Margaret sat on the floor of the library with the letter in her hands for a very long time. Sole heiress. That was the shape of it then. The whole cold, simple shape of it. There it is. The why. It was never about a young man with no fortune. That was just the weapon. Margaret's mother had left money, a real inheritance, meant for Margaret. And as long as Margaret was respectable and marriageable, that money and the family's standing would follow her. So, her aunt did the arithmetic, the same cold arithmetic these stories always turn on, and decided that Margaret had to be removed, ruined, married off, buried in the north, so that everything would flow to her own daughter, Sophia, instead. The young Duke wasn't the target. Margaret's whole life was just the price of Sophia's fortune, and Margaret has just found it in her aunt's own handwriting. But Margaret, being Margaret, saw one thing more. One thing the Duke's lawyers would have missed, because they were looking at the past, and Margaret, who had raised no children of her own but had watched her cousin grow up under that woman's hand, was looking at the present. Sophia. Beautiful, cruel, laughing Sophia, 19 years old, who had never in her life been told no. Sophia, who her mother was, this very season, arranging to marry to the richest and coldest and oldest lord who would have her. A match Sophia hated and wept about, and had no more power to escape than Margaret had had 20 years ago. She's doing it again, Margaret realized, sitting in the cold library with her aunt's letter in her lap. She ruined me to enrich Sophia, and now she's selling Sophia to enrich herself. She has never once, in her whole life, seen either of us as anything but money with a face on it, and something in Margaret, some last cord that 20 years of grinding had worn very thin, quietly, finally, snapped. Not into despair, into resolve. This is why she's the heroine and not just the victim. The easy version of this story ends with Margaret exposing her aunt and walking off on the Duke's arm and leaving cruel, laughing Sophia to the fate she half deserves. But Margaret doesn't get to be free of that house by being as cold as the woman who ran it. She looks at the girl who laughed loudest at her, and she sees another young woman being sold by the same hands that sold her. And she decides to burn the whole machine down. Not just for herself, for both of them. She did not go to her aunt. She let the Duke court her, openly, gloriously, in front of all the London that had laughed, which had the useful effect of making Lady Vane frantic, and a frantic person makes mistakes. She let her aunt believe that the ring had been a coincidence, that nothing was known, that the strange business at the ball had blown over. And quietly, with the Duke's lawyers and her own 20 years of evidence, she built the case, the ledger, the payment, the gossip monger's name, the letter in her aunt's own hand, a statement obtained by the Duke from the gossip monger's still living clerk, who remembered very well who had paid and what for, and she chose her moment, the betrothal dinner, the night Lady Vane meant to announce Sophia's sale to the cold old lord before the cream of society. The night of her aunt's greatest triumph. Margaret would let her stand up, let her open her mouth to announce it, and then Margaret would stand up too. 20 years the furniture, 20 years fetching and carrying and being told she was nothing, and she has arranged it so that the reckoning falls on the exact night, in the exact room, at the exact moment of her aunt's greatest public triumph, with every important person in London watching. Margaret Vane has learned her lesson very well. If you are going to stop being invisible, do it where the whole room is looking. Lady Vane rose at the head of the table, glowing, a glass in her hand. 33 of the finest people in England turned toward her. "My dears," she began, "it is my very great joy tonight to announce—" "Before you do," said Margaret, and stood up. The whole table turned. Margaret Vane, the companion, the furniture, the plain widow in the made-over gown, was on her feet at the foot of the table, perfectly calm, with a bound sheaf of papers in her hand. "Sit down," Lady Vane said, and the warmth was gone from her voice entirely now. "You forget yourself." "No," said Margaret. "For 20 years I did. I'm afraid I've remembered." She set the papers on the cloth. 20 years ago, Aunt, a scandal destroyed me. Came out of nowhere, everyone said. Terrible luck. I was ruined and married to a curate and sent to the north, and I never once understood why." She opened the sheaf. "I understand now. Page 1. A payment from this household's accounts 20 years ago to a man named Josiah Crewe. Perhaps some of you knew Mr. Crewe. He was paid in his day to start whispers about respectable young women. He was paid by this house to start them about me." The silence in that room was total. "Page 4, Margaret went on, and her voice did not shake, and she noted with distant satisfaction that it did not shake. "A letter, your hand, Aunt. The matter of M is happily concluded. S now stands as sole heiress, as she ought always to have been." She looked up. "You ruined me for the money, my mother's money, that was meant for me. You burned my life to the ground so that it would flow to Sophia instead, and you have spent 20 years since letting me fetch your shawls in the house you did it in." Sophia had gone white as the cloth. "And tonight," Margaret said, turning at last to her cousin, "tonight she was going to do it to you, sell you to a man you weep about, Because your usefulness has changed, but your worth to her has not. You are money with a face on it, Sophia. You always were. Exactly as I was. She looked back at her aunt. I've sent copies to the Duke's solicitor, and to 2 of the gentlemen at this table who sit on the bench. I'd stay seated now, Aunt, if I were you. You're going to want to hear what they have to say. Every cruelty that woman ever committed in front of the furniture, she committed because she was certain the furniture didn't matter. And that certainty is the exact thing that just destroyed her. Margaret didn't beat her aunt despite 20 years of being invisible. She beat her with them, with everything she was allowed to see and hear, precisely because nobody thought she counted. Lady Vane was not hanged. The law and the family name being what they were, women like her rarely are. But she was finished, and finished completely. The evidence Margaret had built, the ledger, the letter, the clerk's statement, all of it now in the hands of men with the power to act on it, was more than enough. The stolen inheritance was traced, and what could be recovered, recovered. Lady Vane was quietly stripped of her control of the family money and removed to a small house in an unfashionable county on an allowance that Margaret set, and that was not generous. The cold old lord, presented with a bride whose family was now a byword for scandal, withdrew his offer within the day. Sophia was free of him, and the London that had laughed, that had watched the Duke cross a room and thought it the funniest thing of the season, learned the whole of the truth over the following weeks, the way such places always do. How the plain widow they had mocked was the lost love of the Duke of Ashworth, how she had saved his life 20 years before, as a girl, and been torn from him by the very family that laughed at her. How she had walked into a betrothal dinner alone, and, with nothing but 20 years of things she'd been permitted to overhear, brought the whole house down. Nobody was laughing anymore. The morning after the reckoning, Sophia came to find her. She stood in the door of the library, where Margaret was sorting 20 years of her own life back into some order, pale and smaller than Margaret had ever seen her, all the beautiful cruelty gone out of her, and something frightened and young left behind. You could have let her marry me off, Sophia said. To Lord Crail, you could have exposed her and left me to it. It's what I'd have deserved, after how Her voice failed. I laughed at you. For 4 years I laughed at you. Yes, Margaret said. You did? Then why? Margaret set down the letters. She looked at this girl, 19, cruel because she'd been raised cruel, sold because she'd been raised to be sold, and she found that the anger she'd expected to feel simply wasn't there. Because someone should have done it for me, she said, 20 years ago. Someone should have looked at a frightened girl being sold by that woman and said no, not her, not like this. Nobody did. She almost smiled. I'm not going to be one more person who could have stopped it and didn't, not even for you, especially not for you. Sophia began quietly to cry. Sit down, Margaret said, not unkindly. You're free now, and you have no idea how to be, and I'm afraid there's no one to teach you but me. We'll start with this. You are not money with a face on it, whatever she told you, whatever you believed. She pushed a chair out with her foot. Sit. Sophia sat. The Duke came in the evening, as he had come every evening, and found her in the library with the last of the papers. It's done, he said. All of it. She can't touch you or the girl ever again. He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. 42, a duke, and undone by her the way he'd been undone at the ball. Margaret, 20 years ago I made you a promise, and the world made a liar of me. I've spent every one of those years wishing I'd been faster, stronger, someone who could have made them tell me your name. He stopped. I'm here now. I'm not nobody now, and if you'll have me, I should like, very much, to keep the promise I made a girl with a lantern, 20 years too late. Margaret lifted the cord from around her neck. The ring hung on the end of it, plain and gold and worn smooth, with 20 years of being the only thing that was hers. She looked at it for a long moment. I kept it, she said, because it was the one thing they never managed to take. Every year I thought I'd stop being foolish and put it away, and every year I didn't. She lifted her eyes to him. I didn't keep it because I thought you'd come. I stopped believing that a very long time ago. A breath. I kept it because it was proof I'd once done something that mattered, to someone, when I was still a person the world could see. You never stopped being that person, the Duke said quietly. You were only in a house full of people who'd decided not to look. He held out his hand, not for the ring, for her. I've been looking for 20 years. I never once stopped seeing you. And Margaret Vane, 40 years old, plain, and no longer, and never again invisible, put the ring in his hand and let him put it on hers, where it should have been the whole time. So, here's what I want you to carry with you tonight. For 20 years, everyone who looked at Margaret Vane saw a plain, poor, used-up widow. Furniture, the useful cousin. A woman no one would ever cross a room for. They were so certain. And they built that certainty out of nothing but their own laziness, because a used-up widow is an easier story than a wronged one. She wasn't invisible by accident. She was made invisible, on purpose, by someone who profited from it. And that's the thing these stories keep teaching us. Being overlooked is so rarely bad luck. Someone usually benefits. Someone is usually counting on you, never looking up. And when Margaret finally did look up, she found she'd been holding the truth all along, scattered across 20 years of things she'd been allowed to see and hear, precisely because nobody thought she mattered. The very invisibility they used to bury her was the thing that let her dig her way out. So the next time a room decides someone doesn't count, the quiet one, the plain one, the one holding everybody else's coat in the corner, be the one who looks twice. And if that someone is you, if you are, right now, the person everybody's agreed to stop seeing, then hear this. The story isn't over just because they stopped watching. Sometimes being underestimated is the last thing they'll ever get to do to you. Because the furniture, it turns out, remembers everything. And one day, it stands up. If Margaret got under your skin tonight, if you believe the overlooked ones, the quiet ones, the women the world stopped seeing deserve, in the end, to stand up, then you're my kind of person, and this is your channel. Subscribe and turn the bell on, so the next story always finds you. And tell me in the comments, did you guess who was behind it before Margaret did? And would you have shown Sophia mercy, or let her face what she'd laughed at? I read every single one.